Hey, welcome. As we conclude this series on defeating self-righteousness, over the last few weeks, we've been covering some of these when you fill in the blank statements, when you do this act of righteousness.
Yeah.
And so today we conclude with the idea of when you give to the poor.
Yeah, so this is a specific kind of giving that Jesus brings up, not just any gift to kingdom work, but specifically dear to the heart of God and dear to the heart of Jesus is this idea of taking care of those in greatest need.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, really from the beginning of the biblical story, we see a picture of very generous God who created us in his likeness. And so his call to his people, then this common theme throughout the scriptural narrative is calling his people toward generosity, toward being open-handed and not tight-fisted. I love that language in the Old Testament around this idea of generosity. But then Jesus himself gives us these words that form our bottom line today, this idea that says it is more blessed to give than receive.
Absolutely. And sometimes, we like to receive gifts in our culture especially, and really I think people always have. And so maybe it's hard for us to believe that statement at first until you really test it out and start growing in generosity, and then you find that you grow in the love of giving gifts.
Absolutely. And even that sometimes that reality that when we receive something or consume something, it seems to have diminishing value over time, but somehow the ability to give something and taking the opportunity to give something away becomes a memory even that seems to just hold its value over time. That's a blessing.
Absolutely. And the New Testament is full of examples of this, and we get to see the early church in action, really, throughout the New Testament. But in 2 Corinthians 9, we see an example where there's something going on in the broader church. And so Paul writes to this local church, but he's really talking about something that's going on beyond their walls even. And so it turns out that the church in Jerusalem was suffering greatly because there was a famine in that area, and they were adversely affected by it and really were in a struggle. And so the apostles began to take up a collection from the other churches in other regions that maybe weren't as affected by that famine, and they began to send money towards this church that they no doubt was dear to their hearts, because this church had really birthed the movement of the Jesus movement. And so the apostles and all that they had come to know and love came from that Jerusalem church. So this was an opportunity for them to give back to some people who had really invested and brought the gospel message of salvation to them.
Yeah. And it's interesting in this text because it's like we're hearing Paul's appeal, and really also he's kind of teaching this biblical principle as he offers this invitation for this more affluent church to be able to give to those in need. And there's some really rich language as you look through the text today, the passage, and I'd even encourage you to talk about like what are some of the lines in his language that stand out to you, that inspire you, that convict you, that challenge you, because he's very bold, Paul tends to be, and in this regard is no different, that he doesn't really beat around the bush. He just talks about the importance of how we leverage our resources for the kingdom.
Absolutely. And there's this idea of, let's do it cheerfully, but let's sow seeds that are going to reap a harvest later that is worth something, not just now but eternally. And so it's kind of like this kingdom principle then of like when we give to bless someone else, we are doing something more than we could ever, like it's a better gift than we could ever receive, right? Because we are investing treasure in heaven. And we'll see the reward from that. And not only that, he seems to say there's like an instant reward because you're sparking gratitude and praise to God in the hearts of the people you're blessing.
Right. It almost becomes this economy, right? This economy of blessing, kingdom economy, where there's just this cycle where generosity perpetuates gratitude, and then that ends up turning into more generosity. And what a beautiful vision of how God's people can operate, how we can operate.
Yeah. And it's not like these churches that were giving were all just affluent and giving out of their abundance. And that's one of the cool things he brings up too, is how these churches, these local churches across Asia at that point were like just giving really out of their poverty.
Right.
It reminded me of this time I was at a conference kind of thing, and I saw a pastor friend of mine. So I was in college at the time, and I saw this guy who had been kind of a mentor to me, and just a real nice guy, but I knew he was poor, always served in really tiny churches, and just by his dress and everything, you knew he didn't have a lot. And in that moment, he's like, "Oh, you're in college now," and he handed me this just cash gift that, because I knew his context, was just really too generous, and it made such an impression on me, and it did spark gratitude in my heart for the gift and also for the giver, that that kind of heart that would be so generous when I felt like, man, I should be being generous to you,
Right.
And he was giving that to me, and so there is something special about digging deep in generosity, and it really seems to be the heart of Jesus for his church, that we would not be just a people who give out of what's easy to give, but dig deep and really bless others, and that's, I guess that sparked a different level of gratitude in my heart. It wasn't something of like, hey, I've got money to spare, here you go, but something where it came out of just a heart that wanted to do it, wanted to dig deep and bless somebody.
Right. So in our groups today, one of the things that we've asked you to explore is to kind of talk through how sometimes our intention to be generous doesn't match our actual obedience in that area, and that usually there's some obstacle. Maybe there's a hindrance or a reason we're reluctant or feel unable to be generous and to give to the poor, those in need. And maybe things like some of us would just say, well, honestly, we're struggling with our own financial stewardship situation. And some of us might say it's not that we lack resources, but maybe we just haven't managed things well, or we're not operating on a budget, or we've taken on too much debt, and so it just doesn't feel like there's margin for that. And maybe there's some ways to start navigating that and working through that.
Yeah, I think that we live in a complicated time with this, maybe just because of the affluence of our society and all those safety nets and things that are in place, and how much like substance abuse there is in our society, and mental illness and all those things. And it can feel daunting to think about, like, how do I responsibly give to the poor in a way that'll actually help them? Like, I want to help them, I'm just not sure what's really most helpful. And I feel like if I just start handing money to the next poor person I see, am I really helping them?
Right.
Or am I enabling a problem? How would I know? Yeah. So that's where it helps to have friends.
Again, that could be another place of like talking through that, and a suggestion that we might offer around that, and maybe you can constructively help each other think through some of those obstacles would be the hope of the group discussion. But when it comes to discerning, okay, am I really helping someone, or is this a person that I can really help? One of the things is to align ourselves with organizations who are helping people more effectively, and then we just kind of become partners in the ministry, which is kind of what Paul is calling the church in Corinth to do here. He's like, I vetted the situation in a sense. Like, I'm aware of the need. I know how to connect the resources, but I need your willingness to give. And so there's so many great organizations like that, and parachurch organizations and ministries locally and even beyond. And then, of course, a shameless plug for who you're aligned with right here at First Church of God. And we'll talk more today in our large group time about our care team and some of the ways that we continue to invest in meeting the needs of neighbors in our community and people within our own church family who have need. And so that's a great way to just align ourselves with where there's already good work being done.
Yeah, we're really blessed to be part of a church family that is growing in generosity. And we see God's hand in that, and some of the cool opportunities that He's bringing our way as a church family, and we want to just continue to be obedient in partnering with Him.
Yeah, absolutely.